I thought this was just another rich family story. Until this happened. Billionaire. A wedding gown. A knife pointed at a maid's throat in front of 200 guests. Nobody in that ballroom expected what would happen in the next 60 seconds. And by the time it was over, the whole city was talking about it. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you belong to? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this story travels. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told. About love, loyalty, and a secret that changes everything. Stay with me till the end because trust me, you will not see this coming. The chandeliers were still swaying from the string quartet's last note when the screaming started. Daniel Whitfield had built his life around control. At 34, he ran one of the largest real estate empires on the East Coast. A company his father had started with nothing and that Daniel had turned into something worth billions. He controlled boardrooms. He controlled negotiations. He controlled every headline that ever mentioned his name. But standing in the middle of his own engagement party, watching his fiancée's hand tremble around the handle of a kitchen knife, Daniel realized there was one thing in his life he had never controlled at all: Victoria Hale. Victoria was 30 years old, stunning in a way that photographed perfectly and felt cold in person, the kind of beauty that made rooms go quiet when she walked in. She came from old money that had quietly run out years ago, though nobody at these parties knew that but her. She had spent 2 years planning this night down to the flower arrangements, and she was not going to let a maid ruin it. The maid's name was Grace Okafor. She was 34. And she had worked in the Whitfield household for almost 6 years, ever since Daniel's mother had passed and the big house on the Hudson had needed someone who actually cared about it. Grace was quiet. She kept her head down. She did her work well, and she never once complained, not even on the nights she went home so tired her feet ached through her shoes. Nobody at the party had noticed Grace slip out of the kitchen carrying a small folded note. Nobody, that is, except Victoria. "Give it to me," Victoria hissed, her voice low enough that the string quartet almost drowned it out. Her eyes were wild, darting toward the crowd, checking who was watching. "Ma'am, I don't know what you're talking about," Grace said, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "Don't lie to me." Victoria's fingers closed around Grace's wrist so tightly it left a mark. "I saw you take it from his desk. Give it back right now, or I swear." That was when the knife appeared. It had been sitting on the dessert table, meant for cutting the engagement cake, a beautiful 3-tier confection with sugared roses on top. Victoria grabbed it without thinking, the way people do things in moments of panic that they can never take back. The first person to notice was an elderly guest near the bar, who dropped her champagne glass. The sound of shattering crystal turned heads across the ballroom. And then, one by one, 200 wealthy guests in tuxedos and evening gowns watched in frozen silence as Victoria Hale pointed a cake knife at the housekeeper's throat. "Victoria!" Daniel's voice cracked through the ballroom like thunder. He pushed through the crowd, his heart slamming against his ribs. He had seen Victoria angry before. He had seen her cold, dismissive, even cruel in small ways he had convinced himself were just stress. But this was something else entirely. "Daniel, stay back," Victoria said, not even looking at him, her eyes locked on Grace. "She stole something from your office. Something important. I caught her. Put the knife down." Daniel's voice had gone dangerously quiet, the tone he used in boardrooms right before he ended someone's career. "Right now." Grace stood completely still, tears sliding down her face, not from fear of the knife exactly, but from something deeper. The humiliation of 200 strangers staring at her like she was a criminal, in the very house she had cleaned and cared for every single day for 6 years. "Please," Grace whispered. "I can explain." "Explain." Victoria's laugh was sharp and brittle. You don't get to explain. You get to leave this house tonight. And you get to leave without whatever it is you were trying to steal. Daniel reached his fiancée in 3 long strides and gripped her wrist, forcing the knife down and away from Grace's throat. The blade clattered onto the marble floor, the sound echoing through a ballroom that had gone completely, utterly silent. "What is wrong with you?" Daniel breathed, staring at Victoria like he had never seen her before in his life. And for the first time all night, Victoria didn't have an answer ready. Grace stood there trembling, one hand pressed against her chest, the folded note still crumpled in her other fist. Daniel turned to her slowly, his eyes softening the way they always did when he looked at Grace, though tonight there was something else in them too. Confusion, worry, and the first flicker of a question he was almost afraid to ask. "Grace," he said quietly, "what is that in your hand?" Every guest in that ballroom leaned in, holding their breath, waiting for an answer that none of them, not even Daniel, were prepared to hear. For a long moment nobody moved. 200 pairs of eyes fixed on a folded piece of paper clenched in a maid's trembling hand, as if the entire evening's fate depended on what was written inside it. Grace looked at Daniel, then at Victoria, then back at the small crowd that had gathered in a wide, uncertain circle around them. She had never wanted this kind of attention in her life. Growing up in a small apartment in Newark with her mother working double shifts as a hospital aide, Grace had learned early that the safest place to be was invisible. Keep your head down. Do good work. Don't give anyone a reason to notice you, because when rich people notice poor people, it rarely ends well. "It's nothing," Grace said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "A mistake. I shouldn't have. I'll go." She turned to walk away, but Daniel caught her gently by the arm. "Grace, please. You've worked in this house for 6 years. I trust you more than I trust half the people in this room tonight." His eyes flicked briefly, painfully, toward Victoria. "So tell me the truth. What is in your hand?" Victoria's face had drained of color, though she tried to cover it with an irritated huff. "Daniel, this is embarrassing. Can we please not do this in front of our guests?" "You pulled a knife on her in front of our guests," Daniel said, his voice flat and cold. "I think we're a little past embarrassing." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, someone was already recording on their phone, though nobody there knew yet that the video would end up with 11 million views within a week. Grace's fingers slowly unfolded the paper. Her hands were shaking so badly that Daniel had to reach out and steady them before she could hold it up. It was a letter. Not stolen documents, not blackmail material, nothing that belonged in the plot of a scandal. It was a single page, written in careful looping handwriting, dated 3 weeks earlier. Daniel recognized the handwriting instantly, and his breath caught in his throat. It was his mother's handwriting. Eleanor Whitfield had passed away 2 years ago after a long illness, and in her final months, when the disease had taken most of her strength but never her mind, she had spent hours writing letters. Letters to old friends. Letters to charities she supported. And apparently, letters that nobody in the family had ever known about. Letters to the staff who had cared for her in her final days. "She wrote this to you?" Daniel asked, his voice suddenly very small for a man who commanded boardrooms. Grace nodded, tears streaming freely now. "She asked me not to show anyone until the right time. She said I would know when that was." Her voice cracked. "I found it again last week, going through some of her old things in the study, things nobody had touched since she passed. I was going to give it to you tonight after the party when it was quiet. I didn't want to make a scene at your engagement." Victoria's eyes had gone wide, darting between Daniel and the letter like a trapped animal looking for an exit. "Daniel, I didn't know. I swear I thought." "You thought she was stealing from my office," Daniel said slowly. "And instead of asking her, instead of trusting a woman who has worked in this house longer than you've even known me, you pulled a knife on her. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Daniel had ever heard in his life. He unfolded the letter fully and began to read it, his hands trembling now too. His mother's words filled the page, warm and familiar even in death, and as he read, his throat tightened until he could barely speak. "She writes," Daniel said quietly, reading aloud so the room could hear, though his voice kept breaking, "that in her final months, when the nurses were tired and even I was too busy running the company to sit with her every day, it was Grace who sat by her bed. It was Grace who read to her when her eyes grew too weak to read herself. It was Grace who held her hand at 3 in the morning when the pain was worst, and there was no one else awake in the whole house." A woman near the front of the crowd pressed a hand to her mouth. Even Victoria, for all her cold composure, looked shaken. "She writes that she considered Grace family," Daniel continued, his voice now barely a whisper. "That she wanted me to know whenever the time was right, that this house was safer and warmer because of her. That I should never, ever take her for granted." Daniel looked up from the letter, and his eyes met Grace's. For 6 years, he had walked past this woman in his own hallways 100 times a day, nodding politely, never truly seeing her. And now he understood, all at once, that she had been there for his mother in ways he himself had failed to be. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, and though the words were meant for Grace, everyone in that ballroom understood they were also meant for himself. "I'm so sorry." Victoria stood frozen a few feet away, the knife still lying forgotten on the marble floor between them, and for the first time that night, she realized that the story unfolding in front of 200 witnesses was no longer about a stolen document. It was about her. The party did not end that night, not officially. The band kept playing, awkwardly, because nobody had told them to stop, and the caterers kept circulating with trays of champagne nobody wanted to drink anymore. But something in the air had shifted permanently, and everyone in that ballroom could feel it. Daniel folded his mother's letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, right over his heart, before turning to face Victoria fully for the first time since the knife had clattered to the floor. "I need to understand something," he said quietly. "Why did you think Grace was stealing from my office in the first place?" Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. For a woman who had never once, in 2 years of dating Daniel, been at a loss for words, this hesitation was its own kind of confession. "I saw her coming out of the study," Victoria said finally, "with a paper in her hand. Panic. I thought. You thought a woman who has worked here for 6 years without a single complaint against her suddenly decided to become a thief," Daniel said. "On the night of our engagement party. In front of everyone. I was trying to protect you," Victoria snapped, some of her old composure returning now that she had an audience to perform for again. "Do you know how many people tried to take advantage of families like yours? How many staff members have skimmed money, sold stories to tabloids, stolen jewelry? Grace has never done any of that," Daniel said. "Not once. And you didn't even ask her. You didn't give her the chance to explain. You went straight for a knife." It was at that moment, as the tension in the ballroom stretched thin as glass, that an older man stepped forward from the crowd. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, dressed in a simple but well-tailored suit that marked him as someone who had earned his money rather than inherited it. Daniel recognized him immediately. Frank Doyle, the family's longtime accountant, a man who had managed the Whitfield finances since before Daniel was born. "Daniel," Frank said carefully, "there's something you should know. Something I probably should have told you weeks ago." The room, if possible, went even quieter. "What is it, Frank?" Daniel asked, though something in his gut already told him he would not like the answer. Frank glanced at Victoria, an apologetic and uncomfortable look crossing his weathered face. "There have been irregular withdrawals from the household discretionary account over the past 4 months. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. I've been trying to trace them quietly before bringing it to you, Because I didn't want to make accusations without proof. How much money are we talking about? Daniel asked. Just over $200,000, Frank said. A collective gasp moved through the crowd like a wave. And you have proof of who took it? Daniel asked. His voice dangerously calm now. The calm of a man holding himself together by sheer will. Frank hesitated, then reached into his own jacket and pulled out a folder he had apparently been carrying all evening, waiting for the right moment, or perhaps dreading it entirely. The transfers were authorized using login credentials tied to the household account. I cross-referenced the access logs with the security footage from your home office. He paused, his eyes flicking briefly, painfully toward Victoria. The footage shows Victoria accessing that account on 6 separate occasions over the last 4 months. Every head in the ballroom turned toward Victoria Hale. Her face had gone the color of the pale wedding cake still sitting untouched on the dessert table, its 3 sugared roses somehow mocking in the sudden silence. That's ridiculous," Victoria stammered, but her voice had lost every ounce of its earlier confidence. "Frank, you're mistaken. There's some kind of error." "I checked 3 times," Frank said gently, almost sympathetically, the way a man might deliver terrible news to someone he still, despite everything, didn't want to hurt. "There's no error." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him, the way it does when you realize that the person you were about to marry, the person you trusted with your entire future, might be someone you never actually knew at all. "Victoria," he said slowly, "is this true?" And in the terrible silence that followed, in the space where an honest woman would have found an explanation, Victoria Hale said nothing at all. Which, in front of 200 witnesses and a folder full of evidence, was its own kind of answer. Grace stood off to the side during all of this, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the last 10 minutes. Watching a story unfold that she had never intended to be part of. She had only wanted to give Daniel his mother's letter quietly, privately, away from the noise and spectacle of a party she didn't even feel she belonged at. Instead, she had become the accidental catalyst for the unraveling of an entire engagement. "I want everyone to hear this clearly," Daniel said, turning to address the crowd now. His voice carrying the same authority it carried in every boardroom he had ever walked into, except this time it was shaking, just slightly, with something rawer than authority. 20 minutes ago, my fiancé held a knife to the throat of a woman who sat by my dying mother's bedside every single night when I was too busy to do it myself. She did this because she assumed, without asking a single question, that a hard-working woman must be a thief simply because of the uniform she wears. Victoria opened her mouth to protest, but Daniel held up a hand, and something in his expression made her close it again. "And now," Daniel continued, "it turns out that the real theft in this house, $200,000 of it, was committed by the very woman standing in that white dress, pointing fingers at everyone but herself." "Daniel, please," Victoria said, her voice cracking now, the performance finally slipping to reveal something closer to panic. "Let me explain. It's not what you think." "Then explain," Daniel said. "Everyone here is listening." Victoria's eyes darted around the ballroom, taking in the sea of faces, business partners, childhood friends, members of the city's oldest families, all of them staring at her with a particular hunger that wealthy people reserve for watching one of their own fall from grace. There was nowhere to hide, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria Hale had absolutely no plan. "I have debts," she said finally, so quietly that people in the back had to lean forward to hear. "Gambling debts. From before you and I even met. I thought I could pay them off before you found out, and then everything would be fine and you'd never have to know." $200,000 of gambling debt, Daniel repeated slowly, "that you decided to solve by stealing from my family's account. And when you were worried someone might discover it, Your solution was to threaten the one person in this house who has only ever shown my family kindness. I panicked, Victoria said, tears now streaking down her carefully applied makeup. I saw her with a paper from the study and I thought maybe she'd found something, records, statements, anything that could expose what I'd done. I wasn't thinking clearly. I would never have actually hurt her, Daniel, I swear it. You had a knife at her throat, Daniel said. In front of 200 people. At our engagement party. He shook his head slowly, and something in his face closed like a door being locked forever. I don't think you understand how far past forgivable that already is, even before we get to the money. Grace, watching this unfold, felt something complicated stirring in her chest. Not quite triumph, because there was no joy in watching someone's life collapse in front of an audience, but something closer to relief, the exhausted relief of a person who has been quietly wronged for a long time and is finally, unexpectedly, being seen. Mr. Whitfield, Grace said softly, stepping forward despite every instinct telling her to disappear into the background where she felt safest. I don't want anyone to lose everything over this. I just wanted to give you the letter. Daniel turned to her, and something in his tired, heartbroken expression softened immediately. Grace, you have nothing to apologize for. Nothing at all. He reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. The first time in 6 years he had touched her with anything other than a polite nod in the hallway. Tonight, you gave me back a piece of my mother I didn't know I'd lost. That matters more than any of this. Victoria watched this small, quiet moment of connection between her fiancé and the housekeeper, and something bitter and jealous flickered behind her tear-filled eyes, a feeling she couldn't quite name, though it looked, to anyone paying close attention, almost exactly like the truth she had refused to admit to herself for months, that somewhere in the last year, without either of them fully realizing it, Daniel had started trusting Grace with things he no longer trusted Victoria with at all. Security arrived 20 minutes later, called quietly by Frank Doyle while Daniel stood frozen in the middle of his own ballroom, trying to process the collapse of the life he had spent 2 years building with a woman he now realized he barely knew. They didn't handcuff Victoria in front of everyone. Daniel had that much mercy left in him, even now. Instead, 2 calm, professional security officers escorted her toward a side room off the ballroom, where the police, who had been called separately, would meet her to discuss the missing funds. As she walked past Daniel, she paused. I did love you, she whispered. Whatever else you believe about me, please believe that. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for the woman he thought he knew. Maybe you did, he said finally. But love isn't supposed to come with a knife in one hand and someone else's money in the other. She had nothing to say to that. The officers led her away, and the ballroom watched in stunned silence as the engagement of the season quietly, catastrophically ended before the cake had even been cut. The guests began to leave shortly after, murmuring among themselves, already composing the stories they would tell at brunch tomorrow, at the country club next week, at every dinner party for months to come. Daniel barely noticed them go. He stood near the dessert table, staring down at the abandoned cake knife still lying on the marble floor where it had fallen. His mother's letter still folded against his heart. Grace found him there 20 minutes later, long after the last guest had gone and the caterers had begun quietly clearing away trays of untouched food. You should go home, Daniel said without turning around. You've had a long night. I'm sorry you had to be part of any of this. I don't mind staying, Grace said quietly. If you don't want to be alone. Daniel turned to look at her then, really look at her, the way he hadn't allowed himself to in 6 years of walking past her in his own hallways. She looked tired. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled from the chaos of the evening, and there was still a faint red mark on her wrist where Victoria had grabbed her too hard. But her eyes were steady, kind, the same eyes that had apparently sat beside his dying mother night after night, while he was too consumed with quarterly earnings and board meetings to notice his own mother slipping away. Can I ask you something? Daniel said. Grace nodded. Why didn't you ever tell me? About sitting with my mother, about the letter, about any of it. You could have told me years ago. Grace considered the question carefully before answering. Your mother asked me not to say anything until the right time. She said you were carrying enough weight already, running the company, managing everything after your father passed. She didn't want to add to it. And honestly, Grace added, her voice softening, I think she wanted you to remember her the way you already did, not to feel guilty for the nights you weren't there. She loved you very much, Mr. Whitfield. She talked about you every single night. Daniel's eyes filled with tears he had been holding back all evening, through the knife, through the accusations, through the humiliating collapse of his engagement in front of everyone he knew. It was this, finally, this small kindness from a woman who had asked for nothing in return for years, that broke through. Thank you, he said quietly. For being there when I couldn't be. For everything. She was a good woman, Grace said simply. It was an honor, not a burden. They stood together in the wreckage of the party for a long moment, two people who had shared a house for 6 years without ever really knowing each other, now connected by a grief and a kindness that neither of them had expected to surface tonight of all nights. Neither of them yet realized that this quiet moment in an empty ballroom, surrounded by wilting flowers and an uneaten cake, was the beginning of something that would change both of their lives far more than either could have imagined. The video hit the internet the next morning. Someone at the party, nobody ever confirmed who, had recorded the entire confrontation on their phone, from the moment Victoria grabbed the knife to Daniel's quiet, devastating question about the missing money. By noon it had 500,000 views. By evening it had passed 10 million, with headlines calling it, the engagement party that ended in handcuffs, and Billionaire's fiancée exposed as thief in front of 200 guests. Daniel's phone did not stop ringing all day. Business partners wanting to check in, though he suspected some of them were more interested in the gossip than his well-being. Reporters requesting statements. His lawyer calling about how to handle the police investigation into Victoria's theft. Through all of it, Daniel found himself thinking not about the humiliation, not about the money, not even about the collapse of a relationship he had spent 2 years building, but about Grace, quietly returning to work that morning as though nothing at all had happened, as though she hadn't been the accidental center of the biggest scandal in the city. He found her in the kitchen around noon, preparing lunch with the same careful, unhurried focus she brought to everything. You didn't have to come in today, Daniel said, leaning against the doorframe. After everything that happened last night, I would have understood if you needed time. Grace looked up from the cutting board, a small, tired smile crossing her face. Work helps me think. Besides, somebody has to keep this house running while you deal with lawyers and reporters. Daniel almost laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd managed since the knife had hit the floor. Fair enough. He lingered in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, watching her work, before something Frank had mentioned that morning surfaced in his mind. Grace, can I ask you something else? Frank mentioned you have a daughter. Amara, is it? He said she's a senior in high school this year. Grace's hands paused briefly over the cutting board, a flicker of surprise crossing her face that anyone in this household, let alone Daniel himself, knew anything about her daughter at all. Yes, she's applying to colleges right now. Nursing programs mostly. She wants to help people the way the doctors helped her grandmother when she was sick. That's a beautiful reason, Daniel said quietly. It's expensive though, Grace admitted, then seemed to catch herself as if she'd said too much. We'll figure it out. We always do. Daniel nodded slowly, something turning over in his mind that he wasn't ready to say out loud yet, though the seed of it had already been planted. He thought about his mother's letter, still folded in his jacket pocket where he'd kept it since the night before, the words about Grace's quiet, unrewarded devotion echoing in his memory. He thought about 6 years of a woman working tirelessly in his home, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, while people like Victoria took everything they could get their hands on and still wanted more. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat down with Frank Doyle in his home office, the same office where the theft had first been discovered, and asked him to pull up Grace's full employment file. Not out of suspicion, but out of something closer to shame that he had never once, in 6 years, thought to ask about the woman who had cared for his family so faithfully. What he found humbled him. Grace had never taken a single sick day, even the winter she'd had pneumonia. She had never asked for a raise, even though her salary hadn't increased meaningfully in 3 years while inflation quietly ate away at what it could buy. She had covered extra shifts without complaint whenever the previous housekeeper had needed time off, all while raising a daughter alone since her husband had passed away in a car accident when Amara was only 7 years old. Daniel closed the file and sat in silence for a long moment, staring out the window at the gardens Grace had tended just as faithfully as she'd tended everything else in this house, though gardening wasn't even technically her job. He thought about the knife. He thought about the letter. He thought about the $200,000 Victoria had stolen to cover her gambling debts, money that could have changed Grace's daughter's entire future without Daniel even noticing it was gone. And slowly, quietly, an idea began to take shape. Not out of guilt, though there was plenty of that, but out of something Daniel realized he hadn't felt in a very long time. Genuine, uncomplicated gratitude. 3 days after the party, Daniel asked Grace to meet him in his study after her shift ended. She arrived nervous, smoothing her apron unnecessarily, uncertain whether this meeting meant good news or bad, since her entire life had taught her that when powerful people wanted to talk privately, it rarely worked out in her favor. "Please sit," Daniel said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk, the same desk where his mother had once written the letter that started all of this. Grace sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap. "Is everything all right, Mr. Whitfield? Please call me Daniel. After everything, I think we're past formalities." He smiled slightly, then took a breath, gathering his thoughts. "I want to talk to you about Amara's education." Grace stiffened slightly. "Mr. Whitfield, I don't want any special treatment because of what happened. I didn't tell you about her too." "I know," Daniel interrupted gently. "I know you didn't. That's exactly why I want to do this." He slid a folder across the desk toward her. "I've set up a full college fund for Amara. Tuition, housing, books, everything for whatever nursing program she gets into. It's already funded. It doesn't depend on you continuing to work here, and it doesn't come with any strings attached." Grace stared at the folder without opening it, her eyes filling with tears. She tried, unsuccessfully, to blink away. "I can't accept this. It's too much. You spent 6 years caring for my family," Daniel said quietly. "You sat with my mother when I couldn't. You gave me back a piece of her I thought I'd lost forever. And you never once asked for anything in return, not even when it would have been completely reasonable to. This isn't charity, Grace. This is what should have happened years ago, if I'd been paying attention." Grace opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning the paperwork, the funded account, the letter from the university's financial aid office confirming that any remaining costs beyond the scholarship Amara had already earned would be covered in full. She had spent 17 years since her husband's death worrying about exactly this moment, lying awake at night doing math that never quite added up. And now, in a single conversation, that entire weight had lifted from her shoulders. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Daniel said. "Just let me do this. Please." Meanwhile, across town, Victoria Hale sat in a small, cold conference room with her lawyer, going over the terms of the settlement that would keep her out of prison in exchange for repaying every stolen dollar and accepting a permanent restraining order preventing her from contacting Daniel or any member of his household again. The gambling debts that had started this entire catastrophe were still unpaid, still growing with interest, and the life she had spent years carefully constructing, the parties, the connections, the engagement to one of the city's most eligible men, had collapsed into something small and humiliating within the span of a single terrible night. The video of the confrontation had made her infamous in a way she had never wanted to be famous. Old friends stopped returning her calls. Invitations to the events she used to host stopped arriving. The life Victoria had built on appearances had finally, completely, come apart at the seams, because appearances, it turned out, could not survive contact with the truth. Back at the Whitfield estate, Daniel walked Grace to the door of his study, something lighter in his chest than he had felt in years. "There's one more thing," he said as she turned to leave. "What's that?" Grace asked. "I'd like to invite you and Amara to dinner. Not as staff and employer. Just as people who've been through something difficult together, and maybe should get to know each other properly." He hesitated, suddenly uncertain in a way that surprised him, a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. "If that's all right with you." Grace smiled, the first truly unguarded smile Daniel had seen from her in 6 years. "I think Amara would like that very much." The dinner happened 2 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday evening, in the same dining room where countless business dinners and formal gatherings had taken place over the years, though this one felt entirely different. Daniel had asked the household staff to take the night off, insisting on cooking part of the meal himself, a clumsy but heartfelt attempt at a lasagna that made Grace laugh harder than she had in months. Amara turned out to be exactly the kind of bright, determined young woman her mother's sacrifices had shaped her into, full of questions about Daniel's business, genuinely curious rather than starstruck, occasionally teasing her mother about being nervous over something as simple as dinner. "Mom told me you cook like you're negotiating a hostile takeover," Amara said, eyeing Daniel's slightly lopsided lasagna with amused suspicion. "That's fair," Daniel admitted. "In my defense, I've never actually made this before." "It's edible," Grace said diplomatically, which made all three of them laugh. Over the course of the evening, something unexpected settled into place between them. Not romance, not yet anyway, though something warmer than friendship was quietly beginning to take root, but something more immediate and more important. A sense of family. A sense that the house on the Hudson, which had felt cold and formal for so long, was finally becoming a home again, the way it had been when Daniel's mother was alive. "Can I ask you something?" Amara said partway through dinner, her expression suddenly more serious. "That night at the party, when everyone found out about the money Victoria stole, were you scared?" Daniel considered the question honestly. "I think I was more scared of what it meant than what actually happened. Scared that I'd spent 2 years with someone I never really knew. Scared that I almost married someone who would hurt a person like your mother without a second thought, just to protect a secret." He paused, glancing at Grace. "But I think what scared me most, honestly, was realizing how long I'd walked past your mother in my own hallways without really seeing her. That's the part one keep thinking about." Grace reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly, a small gesture that carried more weight than words could have. "You see me now," she said simply. "That's what matters." The weeks that followed brought quiet, steady changes to the Whitfield household. Daniel raised the wages of every staff member, not just Grace, after discovering during his review of employment files that several longtime employees had been underpaid for years while Victoria had spent freely on things nobody had thought to question. He established a policy that any staff member facing hardship, medical bills, family emergencies, education costs, could apply for direct support from a fund he set up specifically for that purpose, inspired entirely by the mistake he'd nearly made in overlooking Grace for 6 long years. The video of the party continued circulating for weeks, but the story that eventually dominated headlines wasn't about Victoria's downfall anymore. It became a story about Daniel Whitfield's quiet transformation, about a billionaire who had learned, in the most public and humiliating way possible, to actually see the people who kept his life running. Reporters requested interviews, hoping for dramatic quotes about Victoria's betrayal. Daniel declined almost all of them, except for one small local paper that had reached out asking specifically about the college fund he'd set up for Amara. "Why did you do it?" the reporter had asked. "You could have just fired Victoria quietly and moved on. Nobody would have expected this." Daniel thought about his mother's letter, still kept safely in a drawer in his study, about the years Grace had spent invisible in his own home, about the terrible clarity that comes from almost losing something you never realized you had. Because kindness that goes unnoticed for years doesn't stop being kindness, he said. Somebody just finally needs to notice it. 6 months passed, and the estate on the Hudson had changed in ways that went far deeper than fresh paint or new furniture. Amara had been accepted into the nursing program at her top-choice university, fully funded exactly as promised, and she called Grace every week to share updates about her classes, her new friends, the late nights studying anatomy that reminded her, in the best way, of the doctors who had once cared for her grandmother. Grace still worked in the household, though her role had shifted subtly over the months. Daniel had promoted her to household manager, with a salary that finally reflected the years of dedication she had quietly given without complaint, along with a small staff of her own to help manage the property's daily operations. She no longer worried at night about how she would pay for her daughter's future, and for the first time in 17 years, she allowed herself to think about her own future too. Daniel had changed as well, in ways that surprised the people who had known him for years. He attended fewer galas and spent more evenings at home, often sharing dinner with Grace after the rest of the staff had gone for the night, conversations that stretched longer and longer as the months passed, though neither of them had quite named what was happening between them. It was Frank Doyle, of all people, who finally said it out loud one afternoon in the study, going over the quarter's finances with Daniel the way he had for years. "You know," Frank said, not looking up from his paperwork, "in 30 years of managing this family's finances, I've never seen you this settled. Not with Victoria. Not with anyone before her." Daniel looked up, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you smile more since Grace started joining you for dinner," Frank said simply. "I'm just an old accountant, Daniel, but even I can do that math." Daniel didn't answer right away, but that evening, he found Grace in the garden she still tended even though it was no longer technically her responsibility, kneeling beside the roses his mother had planted decades earlier. "Can I ask you something?" he said, echoing the same words he'd used the night he'd shown her the college fund. Grace looked up, brushing dirt from her hands. "Of course. I've been thinking about something for a while now, and I don't quite know how to say it without sounding foolish." Daniel took a breath, the same nervous energy he'd once reserved for billion-dollar negotiations now directed at something far more important. "These last 6 months, having dinner with you, talking with you, watching you and Amara build this new chapter of your lives. It's been the first time since my mother passed that this house has actually felt like a home again. And I think a part of me has known for a while that what I feel for you isn't just gratitude anymore." Grace's breath caught, her eyes searching his face carefully, as though checking to see if this was real. "Daniel, I'm your employee. Or I was. I don't want you to feel obligated." "I don't feel obligated," Daniel said gently. "I feel grateful, and I feel something else entirely, something I haven't let myself feel in a very long time because I was too afraid to trust it. I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. I just didn't want to spend one more day not telling you the truth." Grace was quiet for a long moment, the evening light catching the tears gathering in her eyes, tears that this time were entirely different from the ones she'd cried the night of the party. "I've spent 17 years telling myself I didn't have room in my life for anything other than survival," she said softly. "Working, raising Amara, getting through each day. I never let myself imagine anything more than that." She reached out and gently took his hand. "But these past 6 months have made me remember what it feels like to hope for something again." A year after the night the knife had fallen onto the marble floor of the Whitfield ballroom, a much smaller, much quieter gathering took place in the same garden where Daniel's mother's roses still bloomed every spring. There were no 200 guests this time. No orchestra, no towering wedding cake with sugared roses, no headlines waiting to be written about scandal or betrayal. Just close friends, Frank Doyle standing proudly near the front, and Amara, now in her second year of nursing school, serving as her mother's maid of honor with tears of pure joy instead of the confusion and fear that had marked that terrible night 1 year earlier. Grace wore a simple, elegant dress, nothing like the elaborate gown Victoria had worn that first fateful evening, but Daniel thought, watching her walk toward him through the garden, that he had never seen anyone more beautiful in his entire life. "You clean up nicer than the maid I remember," Daniel whispered as she reached him, and Grace laughed through her tears, swatting his arm gently. "I was never just the maid," she reminded him softly. "I think it just took you a while to notice." "I noticed everything about you," Daniel said. "It just took a knife and a stolen letter to make me brave enough to say it." The ceremony was small, warm, and utterly unlike the world of appearances and status that had once defined Daniel's life. He had learned, in the most painful and public way imaginable, that the people who truly deserve trust are rarely the ones who demand it loudest, and that kindness quietly given, year after year without recognition, is worth infinitely more than any amount of polish or performance. Victoria Hale, for her part, had rebuilt a much smaller, much quieter life in another city. Having repaid every stolen dollar and finally, after years of running from it, gotten help for the gambling addiction that had cost her everything she once thought mattered. She was not invited to the wedding, of course, but somewhere far away, watching the news of Daniel Whitfield's engagement to his former housekeeper, she found herself, for the first time, genuinely wishing them well, understanding now, too late for herself but not too late for someone else, what it truly meant to value the right things. As the small ceremony came to a close and the guests raised their glasses in the golden evening light, Daniel pulled Grace close and whispered the same words his mother had once written in a letter that changed everything. "This house is safer and warmer because of you," he said. "It always has been. I'm just glad I finally learned to see it." Grace smiled up at him, thinking of her mother back in Newark working double shifts so many years ago, of her husband who never got to see how strong she'd become, of her daughter now building a future once thought impossible, and of a single folded letter that had, against every odd, brought her exactly here. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the people who see us clearly aren't the ones closest to us. They're the ones who finally slow down long enough to look." And in that quiet garden, surrounded by roses planted by a woman who had believed in Grace long before her son ever did, two people who had once been separated by nothing but a title and an uncrossed distance finally began the life they had both, without knowing it, been waiting for all along. If this story touched your heart even a little, that's exactly why we tell them. Because somewhere out there, someone reading this needed the reminder that kindness is never wasted, even when it takes years to be seen. If you felt something tonight, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.